Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Hebrew. All of these books in the New Testament have been attributed to Paul, the man in this window. Maybe he wrote them all, and maybe some were written on his behalf. But either way, the books of the Bible attributed to Paul make up almost half of the New Testament. 15 out of 27 books. And on top of that, half of the book of Acts is about Paul and his works for Christ. So, even though Paul wasn't one of the original 12 disciples, he's still a pretty important guy for Christianity. So let me tell you a little bit about Paul. First, his birth name was Saul. Historians believe that he was born in Tarsus around 5 AD. And his parents were Pharisees, meaning that they strictly adhered to the Jewish law, and they believed that Hebrews were the only true people of God. So, based on what his parents taught him to believe, he grew up to be a Pharisee. He had some relatives who were Christians and followed Jesus, but not him. No. He persecuted Christians, wanted them imprisoned, and he was pretty responsible for a lot of deaths. But one day, on the road to Damascus, Jesus came to him in a vision, asking, "Why are you persecuting me?" They had a little bit of a conversation, and then after this vision, Saul was blind for 3 days, until a disciple named Ananias went to him, prayed over him as the Lord commanded, and restored his sight. Saul immediately saw the awesomeness that was Jesus and his sacrifice, so much that he immediately went, got baptized, and began sharing the good news of Christ. I mean, at first, people didn't really believe. I mean, with his reputation, people are like, "It's a trap. Don't listen to him." But eventually, their words won him over, or his words won them over, and he became a trusted and well-respected disciple. And because of this transformation, he wanted to shed himself of his old identity, and he changed his name to Paul. Then went on to be one of the first evangelists for Christ, and traveled from place to place, sharing the good news of what Christ did for us. So now I've told you a little bit about Paul. Now I want to take the time to talk about the books that he wrote. I want to think about them as they were actually meant to be. Letters. I can't speak for everyone, but I often forget why they were originally written. I just don't think about them in that context. But he didn't write these letters in hopes that one day they would be put into the canonical Christian text, that he would be so remembered that he would have a window in this church. He wrote them as letters to different people and different churches that he had met in his travels. And he built relationships with these people. And you can sort of see some clues about his relationships in each of his letters. Like in Ephesians chapter 1, he says, "I have not stopped giving thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers." Or in Romans, relationship seems a little bit more rocky, when he says, "I am thankful that I did not baptize any of you except for Crispus or Gaius." And regardless of his tone, it implies that he spent enough time in each of these places to get to know the people by name. Paul built relationships with these people by getting to know them and then sharing the word of Christ. His goal was to share the good news of what Christ did for the world. But he also understood the importance of building relationships and respect before he could try and convert people. Especially because back then, Jesus wasn't as widely known as he is today. I mean, this just happened. And there wasn't instantaneous knowledge of what's going on. It was all by word of mouth. So who were these people going to believe? A man that they had come to respect and care for? Or some lunatic standing on the street that they had never met before spouting off about some dead guy? I mean, think about it. If you saw them on the street, who would you believe? So Paul became who he needed to be to build relationships and then use those relationships to build disciples. But building these relationships wasn't the most important part. It was very important, don't get me wrong, but I think the important part was how Paul sustained these relationships through the letters that he wrote. Paul didn't just make friends with these people, turn their whole world upside down, and then abandon them. Peace out, see you later. You can figure it out on your own. He didn't do that. And maybe if he had, people wouldn't have remembered what they were taught, and they would have slid back, and the world would be drastically different. But Paul sustained the relationships that he had built in his travels. Paul, even while he was in prison, wrote to these churches to check and make sure that they were living a life of Christ, and reminding them of what he had taught them while they were together. Because that's what you do when you care for someone, right? You don't just build a relationship and then once you're apart, never ever talk to them again and hope that they're doing all right. Especially in a situation like Paul's, where his relationships were specifically meant to create disciples. He wanted to create lasting, true disciples who would learn to love Jesus so much that they would share the news with their neighbors and with their children for the world to evolve. Now, as good Christians, we always worry about the sake of someone's soul and their relationship with Christ. So much so that we forget to think about our relationship with the person and how that could affect them. Sometimes we want so badly for a person to change their ways that we yell at them and we try and force it down their throat, which ends up sending them in the opposite direction. I saw a quote the other day from a book by John Burke called The Monday Masterpiece, and I really think it speaks to what I'm trying to say this morning. It goes like this. Think about it. Jesus didn't confront Zacchaeus about his thieving practices. He offered a relationship, and that changed Zacchaeus. Jesus didn't make sure the woman at the well understood that sex outside of marriage was wrong. He offered her living water that made the muddy water distasteful. Jesus didn't remind the woman caught in adultery that she broke the 10 Commandments. He didn't have to. He set her free from condemnation so that she could go and sin no more. He offered a chance to live a new life. Relationship was Jesus' solution to sin. Can we offer restorative relationships to very muddy people? That is what it takes to be like Jesus. This quote tells us that relationships are important. And I think that when we have a relationship with a person, we begin to share our message. First, through our actions and how we treat one another, and then later through our words. In the scripture today, Paul is telling us the importance of building relationships and becoming relatable to the people we're trying to connect with. We need to try and understand them and what they're going through before we can lead them to Christ. Let me ask you a question. If you don't understand how to fix a lawnmower, are you going to reach your hand right on in there and start messing with the gears and things inside the lawnmower? No. First off, you'll probably break it even more. And secondly, you could hurt yourself in the process. So what do? You research the lawnmower. You find out everything that you can about the mower and the problem you're having. Find the parts that it needs, and then you read the instructions, and you fix it. And then when you get frustrated, you don't kick the lawnmower. People are the same way. don't kick people. But honestly, we can't just start tearing at someone's lifestyle and expect them to be fixed. We need to love them, see the good in them, and respect them enough to understand who they are and what they're going through. And when you get frustrated, you take a breath and you keep working. On a side note here, in honor of Independence Day, I just want to take a second and ask you to imagine what would have happened had the king taken a moment to try and understand the settlers in the 1700s. If he had taken the time to get to know them and their needs, things could have been a little differently on his side. But anyways, Paul's letters are examples on how to sustain relationships. But his words tell us how to be good Christians. His words remind us that sometimes we need to play different roles for different people. Paul became like a Jew to win the Jews, meaning he participated in their customs and their prayers, and he followed their rules while he was with them, because that was the only way that he knew he could build a relationship and gain respect, so that one day they would be able to listen to what he had to say openly. He did what he needed to do to embody and share the gospel, and so should we. Now, some of you have heard me talk about this camp that I go to during the summer. This year would have made year 11, but I was honored to be here with you guys, so instead of going the whole week, I decided to visit on my day off. And there, I got to talk with some of my old friends and see them. But one lady, she's been there as long as I can remember. She went there as a kid, and now she's a counselor there, and she was one of my first counselors there too. She is a wonderful woman. She inspires me every day because she is one of the kindest, most loving, and faithful people I have ever met. But when we were talking, we started talking about this fellowship event she participates in her community every other Sunday. And during this time, she goes to the Islamic temple, shares a meal with them, and participates in their prayer. And while she's there, she wears a scarf over her head in place of a hijab to show respect. But she's not Muslim. Why would she ever wear something so oppressive? Well, first off, to these women, it's not oppressive. It's their sign of respect to God. And secondly, think about what she's doing here. She's building relationships with them through fellowship, respecting their customs, and learning about what they believe. And then having the opportunity to have meaningful discussion about the gospel. I mean, I don't know if you know who that might sound like. I have no idea. Certainly not a man who would make himself like a Jew to, relate to the Jews. She's interacting with people who are very misunderstood today, and she's learning so much about them. Like, do you know that Muslims believe Jesus was a great prophet? Or that to be good Muslims, they should follow the rules set by Christ and follow his example. They still follow old laws, and they don't consider him a deity, but we might have a little more in common than we like to think. But she uses this fellowship with them to discuss beliefs, unlike a lot of us today who are too afraid to associate with people who are different from themselves. But that's what Paul did too, and that's what we need to do. Now, in this verse, this scripture today, there's a certain exaggeration that Paul talks about and that he doesn't want to happen. And he sort of tells us this in his wording when he says, "To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law." Sort of like a little disclaimer you see in the medicine commercials. But Paul isn't saying that if you're trying to build a relationship with someone who smokes, that you need to go out, pull out a cigarette, and start smoking. And he is definitely not saying that to relate to a murderer, you need to go murder somebody. Please don't do that. It's not socially acceptable. But maybe next time your new friend who smokes goes out for a smoke break, go with them. how awful smoking is for their body, which we know it is. But what's the priority in that moment? Telling them that they're wrong? Or building a relationship with them? Making them feel like an insider when they may feel like an outsider because they always miss out on conversation. The priority is bringing this person closer to Christ through building a relationship and letting them know that one day, when they decide to quit, you will be there with them all the way. So don't be afraid to go out and associate with people different from yourself. Don't be afraid to learn about their customs and their beliefs. As long as you know where you belong and you strengthen your relationship with Christ, none of these things can affect you. We can do all things in Christ. And if you put your faith in Him, you can't fail. So be like Paul. Build relationships with people who differ from you and care enough about those relationships to sustain them.